Okay. All right. So we'll get started, and hopefully we'll get some more folks joining in the next few minutes. It's funny. I can't actually remember the exact title that I gave to today's public lecture. I think it was something along the lines of work, children, and related paradoxes. I don't need to look that up, but it's broadly, that's similar or close to what the title was. And so I'm going to get us started. Once again, I'd like to do a quick show of hands for people who are library patrons as opposed to St. Mary's students. Michael, oh, cool. And Michael, welcome. Is this your first time that you've come to this? If so, raise your hand, Michael, but Michael's not raising his hand. So he's been here before. Cool. All right, well, what I want to do is I want to start with a very brief overview. As the St. Mary students know, and as unfortunately, I have to offer another apology. I still have not had a chance to upload readings for the library patrons. I promise I'm going to do that this week. But today's discussion is based in part, and in no small part, on the chapter in this book that deals specifically with work. And I believe the name of that chapter is Why Children Work, yeah. And the chapter deals with work, broadly speaking, but certainly not too broadly, because it deals primarily with children working in what I'll call low-income parts of the world, but then also with kind of Western or more privileged groups of people's ideas around childhood and as it relates to work. And that's really what I want to get into today, is the sort of the intersection of those two things, the understandings that I'll call relatively privileged people. And to be clear, that's not just people living in low-income countries. In fact, Burr's, the author of the book is Burr, Rachel Burr, points out regularly that she's also, when she's talking about ideas around child labor, she's also talking about the people who are relatively privileged, but living in Vietnam, so middle class or relatively well-off people in Vietnam as well. And again, it's the idea, the construction, the social construction of the idea of the child worker versus the lived experience. And that's a key to this discussion. So to get us started, I have a couple of things that I want us to do in a very Canadian context. And we'll start with this. Oh, sorry, I should actually, back up and just share a screen.
How you doing?
I'm teaching. Sorry, Jonathan just showed up.
Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no worries at all. Yeah, and hi, stranger. Okay, so I'm sharing my screen and everyone can see. Ignore this over here. Can I get rid of that? No, probably not. What I want you to look at, this is Forbes magazine. Somewhat to my surprise, I'll give you my understanding of Danielle Cohn, and that is yesterday, on the CBC. I can't even remember what show, but this person who's I think now maybe 15 or 16, her name is Danielle Cohn. Actually, we gotta stop for a second. Can I get anyone who knows who this person is to raise their hand? Not sure if I can see it in this view, but anyone who knows who Danielle Cohn is, raise your hand. Okay, I have a hand from Jill. Only Jill. Interesting. Okay, well, this is Danielle Cohn. She came to my understanding of her came from a show on the CBC yesterday, radio. Then I looked her up, and she is an influencer and kind of like a pop star primarily through TikTok. Again, my limited understanding is what you're hearing right now. But she is someone who basically goes on TikTok, as far as I can tell, and performs. And she attracted the attention of all kinds of large corporations who then basically use her platform, from what I can tell, to essentially advertise and market their products. And she in turn gets paid lots of money for this. And her work is essentially to be herself, but in a performative way, including singing and dancing. I'm not going to go to the trouble to show you some of the stuff that's on her website, or no, her TikTok, whatever page. Again, I don't have the language, the vocabulary to adequately describe all the machinations of this. But regardless, you can flip through this article even and read about her. And when I say she's working, I mean she's earning at least multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars a year doing this. She's been very successful in that regard. So I'm going to stop there for a second because I want to come back to the group. We've now got 9 of us here. And I would love for somebody just to give a quick comment or idea about this, this child and who, to be clear, when she started doing this, becoming an influencer, which is her job, essentially. She's an influencer. That's what she does as an occupation. I'd love to hear someone's comments. Ideally, you would raise your hand and talk, but if you feel like putting them in the Q&A, that's fine too. Anyone want to jump out? I would love for this to be a little more interactive of a discussion today. And for some reason, my computer seems to be heating up. Anyone? We're in chat. No, not related to this. Man, no one has any comments about Danielle. No one. All right, fair enough. Well, keep Danielle in mind. We're going to go to our next North American example. And I'm assuming that at least most of you are familiar. Oh, sorry, I have to share my screen again. Boy, I think I'd get used to this. So this is a short video, 7 minutes, but I want to play the whole thing. You'll know why in just a minute, or well, maybe not, but I hope you do. All right, so perhaps some of you are familiar. I'm gonna turn my volume up so everyone can hear. And maybe when I turn it on, I'll go ahead and shut the door to my office because I want everyone to be able to hear this. And here we go. Okay, so poor Kevin Leary. I would love to get some feedback from all of you. If anyone has something to say, you can just add your thoughts right now. I do have a couple of questions, but I'll wait just a minute or two and see if anyone has any thoughts. St. Mary students have just read a book about child labor or why children work. They might have some thoughts. It'd be great if you shared them. Anybody? So please try to do it, if you would, in the Q&A, not in the chat. It's really hard for me to keep track of both. So if you've got some thoughts, please share them in the chat, or sorry, the Q&A. I would love it if people raise their hand and just talk. I know it's a bit of an imposition, perhaps. Anyone? Okay, let me be more specific. I'll go over the video real quick, some of the main points. These young people are working. They're producing something in a commercial kitchen. You could think about that in some ways as a factory. They're working in a factory. They range in age, but some of them are certainly well under what normally you would be legal working age in Canada. They are selling at a local market. So they're producing in a factory, they're selling in a local market. And man, they're being celebrated. Okay, I got someone who wants to talk. Rupert.
Hey, can everybody hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Awesome. So I mean, that was a really interesting video. I'm proud of these young entrepreneurs. But the issue I have with this is that on one hand, for these young children, these young entrepreneurs, it's being promoted, I guess, and encouraged in a way where, on the other hand, if we look at child laborers, for example, in India, or even a lot of these East Asian countries, it's pretty much frowned upon. So it's like a double-edged sword in a way, where on one hand it's good, but then on the other hand it's bad. If you understand what I'm trying to say.
I do understand what you're saying, Rupert. And I would like us to get started today by trying to unpack that contradiction, because for me, the contradiction is like literally right in your face, almost screaming at you. Because certainly in an international context, like unfortunately the library patrons haven't had a chance to read the book chapter that the St. Mary students did, but certainly if we think about the perception of child labor, say among middle-class Canadians in a context like Vietnam, and we compare that to this episode of The Dragon's Den, I mean, quite literally, there are things like, oh, these are quotes from these very important, supposedly, Canadians, saying things like after they present, after the Hope Blooms presents their project and explains exactly what they're doing, i.e. working in a factory at a very young age, selling their products in a market, and they're doing it and earning income. It's not entirely clear what happens with all of the income, but regardless, they're earning, let's say they're earning profit. And there's things like, oh my God, this is fantastic. Oh, it makes me cry. And then there's actual more crying. And then the one guy's like, oh, I'm gonna make sure my kids don't watch all of these, but I'm gonna make sure they watch this one. And he goes on to explain why, because he says, the earlier the better. Getting to work on something, the earlier the better. So for me, this flies right in the face of the other sort of norms and expectations around child labor. And I'm just wanting to know if someone wants to offer an explanation as to why. I'm gonna tap Jill here. Hello, Jill, unmute yourself.
Hi. I feel like it's kind of like towing the line between, where's my words? Gosh, I just had them in my head. Now they're gone.
No worries. So I guess, are you observing the contradiction as well?
It's like, if they have the passion and, like the ability to say like, yeah, I want to go do this today, as opposed to doing something else, as long as they're not being forced, like, oh, you can't play video games today, you have to go down to the kitchen and cook those things. I feel like if it's something they want to do and they're passionate about it and they want to learn about how to own a business someday, then that's great. But I don't know, so I can't really say.
Okay, so this points to one of the sort of elements of this for sure, and that is whether the labor is coerced. And certainly, even though, and one of the things I'll back up and sort of point to is that Rachel Burr, in her look at childhood in a Vietnamese context, where she's hanging out with, spending time getting to know the lives of children who, I don't want to call them street children because she's very careful to problematize that term, but they are children who, in an urban context, they live at least part of their lives away from home. It might not be on the street, as in literally sleeping in some nook or cranny on the street. But in general, they're often spending evenings, nights, sleeping not at home, and they work in various capacities. She brings up things like selling postcards, selling gum, shining shoes. And they're doing it because they need to. And one of the things that she brings up, though, is that it's not especially accurate to say that these children are coerced into working, which is, I think, in part what Jill was sort of explaining. So I'm just going to read. Daniel's talking about how he's heard of people talking about child labor in other countries as immoral and that it needs to be stopped. And that this is happening. The perception of that labor is that it's all taking place in sweatshops or in mines, and it's part of, and that's what sort of child labor is globally. So anybody else want to offer their thoughts as to this contradiction? For those of you who just sort of maybe started a little bit, came in a little bit late, we just watched the Dragon's Den episode where Hope Blooms comes on and are celebrated to an extent that literally the adults in the room are all crying because this work that these children, the manual labor and the marketing and the selling is so straightforwardly awesome, apparently, that people are brought to tears. And then this would appear to contradict what I would consider fairly broad norms in Canada, that child labor is a wholly negative experience, especially if people are doing it to earn income. I do want to let that sit for a little while. I'd love to hear from somebody, especially say one of the library patrons, about why we think this is so. Jill, you want to say more?
Yeah, I was just realizing I grew up in Girl Guides, and you could almost say that us selling Girl Guide cookies is a form of labor. Learning that, like, I learned a lot about how to deal with money and, you know, the public and sell things, and like that's still a skill I use today. And like, you know, I didn't really see any of the money. I seen a small portion of the sales, and sometimes I didn't really want to be there, but I had to go because So that's kind of an interesting thing to consider when we're thinking about this, I guess.
Sure. I'm going to tap Cassandra. Oh, what's going on here? Here we go. Cassandra, unmute and you're ready to go.
Yeah, so like there are lots of ways we get children to engage in, like, I guess, social
So just Cassandra, hold on. You're kind of fading. If you just maybe move a little closer to your mic.
Is that better?
That's better.
Okay. There are a lot of ways we get children to engage in social entrepreneurship.
Wow. Sorry, Cassandra. You're now fading again. I'm not sure what the problem is. It doesn't seem to be internet related. I'm going to try one more time and just make sure you're relatively close to your mic.
Yeah, is that better?
It is, yeah.
Okay. I'll try going a little slower. There are different ways we ask children to engage and stuff like that as well, not just selling cookies, but like even at Halloween, we send them around to collect food or money for UNICEF. So we ask them to engage in a lot of social donation, but not at their own profit. So there's kind of a bit of a juxtaposition there, that they're allowed to work for the community, but they're not allowed to work for themselves.
Right. So, I mean, do you have anybody have any thoughts as to why you think that is? And I mean, more specifically, coming back to Hope Blooms, why is it not? And again, it's not just that it's okay for them to participate in factory labor and selling stuff at a market. It's like robustly, almost bombastically celebrated. Like literally the participants on the panel and perhaps even people at home are crying because these young people are doing this. Well, I'll offer my thoughts. Oh, sorry. So it gets to the heart, really, of Rachel Burr's kind of critical thinking as it pertains to child labor. And again, it really has to do with the very strange contradiction when it comes to, and it's not only a contradiction, it's really, it's part double standard, it's part stereotype, it's part contradiction, sort of all those things wound up together. And she points out that, you know, when we think about child labor as people living in North America, something pretty specific comes to mind. So bear with me one more time here, and I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to go to this one, I believe. Yeah. So for example, I've already typed it in there. If I put child labor in a simple Google search, and I press search, and I go to images, like, it's pretty obvious. And I don't mean to say that Google Earth is the teller of all things in terms of what people conceptualize, but certainly as one indicator, this is what child labor looks like. And Burr is pointing out that in the media that she paid attention to, in the NGO brochures that she's looked at, in the stories that she hears from ordinary people from like a Western European and North American context, this is what child labor looks like. It's drudgery, it's exploitative, it's problematic in a way that is just undisputable. This one in particular, hazardous conditions. This is what child labor looks like from a North American perspective. And really what Burr is trying to emphasize throughout her ethnographic account is that these are very no white children, indeed. Yeah, Hope Blooms does not come up when you do a Google search for child labor. And so on the one hand, Burr can't really talk in great detail about North American perspectives on this because it's not the focus of her research, but she certainly is paying attention to things like media reports and what ordinary people that she encounters say about child labor. And I think we can all basically agree that if we think about some of those images and the experience that they suggest is that of children who labor, then it seems robustly negative and highly problematic, and that we would want to just absolutely stop it. And this is the disconnect that Burr really wants us to pay attention to, because indeed, there are lots of circumstances where children are working in situations that are terrible. Importantly, the same applies to lots of adults. So labor, exploitation, and hazardous work, and all those kind of things that we assume about child labor, working in factories that are sort of these soul-sucking, mindless jobs. Yes, children working in those environments, Rachel Burr and lots of other people are arguing that those are problematic and that it would be much better if children didn't have to do that. But Rachel Burr also is quick to argue, or not quick to argue, but argues persuasively and with a book that demonstrates really time and time again that her position is well researched, that to categorically deny children the ability to work and ban child labor, say with international or national legislation or directives or things like the UNCRC, is actually a much more destructive undertaking potentially than is the continuation of child labor, as long as we haven't actually created a world where child labor isn't necessary. And I think that's an important part of where Burr steps in and provides quite important understandings and countering some of the other stereotypes that go along with child labor. One of which is that we assume that when children are working, other than of course Hope Bloom's children, but when we look at child labor in a different context, we assume a number of things. And one of those things is that we assume that the parents of those children either aren't involved in their lives at all, on the one hand, or that they just simply don't care about their children. And again, these are assumptions, huge assumptions that Burr wants us to sort of stop and reconsider. Because in her experience, and to be clear, her experience is a long-term ethnographic study of such children in Hanoi, Vietnam. She found that it was quite the opposite, that the majority of parents who have children in these situations, i.e. they're working on the streets in Hanoi, and it would be broadly similar where I spent a lot of time in Ho Chi Minh City, the parents are typically still involved in their children's lives to some degree. So it could be sporadic, but they're not completely gone. And they're caring parents who want the best for their children. And in fact, if the option was there for them not to work, they wouldn't have their children working either. Again, these are the perspectives of the parents who are directly involved in children working in these contexts. If you give me just a minute, I'm going to check questions. I have to, Daniel wants to know if we think that the worries about child labor come from the dangerous conditions that children worked in during the Industrial Revolution. Oh, I'm sure that plays a role. I mean, although it's hard, it would be really hard to track that. We'd have to sort of have some sense of what has been passed down from one generation to the next. But give me just a minute. I actually want to shut the blinds behind me. That's creating a big glare for me. So give me 1 minute. Okay, I think that's slightly better. So I'll pause for a second and see if anyone has any thoughts they'd like to add at this point. And then I'm gonna go to my notes and try to stray. We've only got about 20 minutes. So I wanna stay on task here by going back to my notes, but feel free to add any thoughts. And again, I would love it if people would actually Sheila is asking, can we look at work as an important way to learn how to improve your lot in life instead of negative? Well, I think it's a really important question. And in fact, this is one of the things, okay, I'll jump to that one because it is one of the things that Rachel Burr, the anthropologist in Vietnam, looks at. And again, this is among children in Vietnam who, if quite frankly, any of us with no context would travel to Vietnam and as tourists experience these children on the street, I think we would fairly quickly jump to the conclusion that it's problematic, and not just moderately so, but like probably think the things that Burr finds other sort of non-Vietnamese or privileged Vietnamese people thinking about the children, which is that their lot is terrible. But Burr's, at one point in the book, she's explaining that, well, actually, the work that these children undertake is something that directly benefits them. This is one of the things that's perhaps the most troubling for a North American audience, potentially, to basically grasp and almost believe that, in fact, the situation that these children find themselves in, while not ideal, has benefits, multiple benefits. And one of the ones that she points to is the fact that it actually can improve their status. And so she explains, and keep in mind, when she's doing this, she's doing it through sort of storytelling, ethnographic storytelling. So she knows these children, and she's providing the reader with their names, and which are probably pseudonyms, and with a profile of who these children are, what kind of jobs that they undertake, what is their family background, why are they doing what they're doing, and what does that lived experience actually look like if you're there observing it closely. Because again, this is one of the things she's going to explain to us, is that we don't understand these children's lives. Many of the NGO people don't understand these people's lives. Certainly, if you're talking about tourists showing up and seeing it, those tourists are not going to have a good understanding of what's going on. But the status of these children is improved. For example, she points to multiple children, and these are children who work, but because she has multiple different, there's so many different situations that these children find themselves in, and the situations where they're clearly not living on the street. They're living at home, but they are working. In one example, it's a family who has a photocopy shop, and the children are actively involved in the labor on a regular basis. And in fact, another home where children work in a family business, she highlights that, you know, the daughter, this young woman who worked there from a relatively young age, greatly benefited from that experience, in part because among her family, among her neighbors, among friends of the family, she was perceived as contributing to the family, perceived as a responsible young person, and was again benefiting in terms of her status from participation in that work, which was work geared at improving the family's economic situation. Just someone else talking about is necessary. So the other, so I should also point out that Burr's not sort of running around with her head in the clouds, so to speak. She's also observing the daily not so wonderful aspects of these children's lives. The fact that they deal with police harassment. So I'll give paint a picture of one of the groups of kids, or some of the kids she gets to know. Kwa and Bin are two young boys, and man, I'm forgetting their ages. I think 10 to 12 years old. And if some of the St. Mary's students want to fill in here for me, give me the ages. I can't remember how old Kwa and Bin are respectively in this case study, but they are shoe shiners. And there's a couple of, like, she tells their story in a couple of different ways. And one of which is just to describe what they do. And that is they shine shoes outside of a fairly nice cafe in downtown Hanoi. And so there's multiple things about their experience that's very, very interesting. And to repeat, Burr is arguing, well, if we don't understand their actual lived experience, how can we try to explain to, say, the policymaker or anybody else that their lives are actually ones that we should not immediately try to ban in terms of their participation in something called child labor. And so these two boys working at this fairly nice cafe have a very interesting relationship with the adults who also work there. Now, keep in mind, the boys aren't officially working for the cafe. The cafe, like most cafes in Hanoi at the time of this research especially, would be, you know, a building likely with seats on the inside and then at least a handful of seats on the outside on the sidewalk. And these two boys do a variety of things, including they form important relationships with the owners of the cafe, with the wait staff of the cafe, the people officially associated with the cafe. And this is beneficial in multiple ways for them, including simply just letting them work there. And so I can hypothesize, because I've seen this hundreds of times, that one of the things that this family who owns the cafe could provide for these two very young shoe shiners is simply protection from the police, because the police are regularly, and this is one of those negative aspects of child labor on the streets of Hanoi that Burr points to, they would, you know, regularly have to face police who would somehow try to persecute them or harass them, or for that matter, try to get a bribe out of them to allow them to stay working there. Well, the cafe owner could play a really important role in protecting the Hua and Bin from that activity. And by simply allowing them to scurry inside the actual cafe when the police come by, which is oftentimes very easy to know because everyone else in the block up from you is doing the same thing, kind of scurrying to make sure that they don't get sort of harassed or forced to pay a bribe. They, at one point in the story, because again, Rachel Burr is following these young kids for quite some time, the cafe actually moves. And I can't remember exactly why, but the cafe moves from one location to the next. And indeed, Hua and Bin are invited to come along and make sure that they bring their little business, basically, their entrepreneurial enterprise, along with them to continue this relationship where they work alongside the cafe, providing shoe shining service for the cafe's patrons, and being sort of both socially engaged with the staff and the clients, and also supported by in various ways, including things like the occasional meal, or if someone was in trouble, the adults would potentially help out, not unlike a parent. And so this is just one of the many sort of stereotypes or erroneous assumptions that Burr wants readers to understand, which is that just because the children are not in a formal institution of some sort, but say that's school, or even directly working in the formal economy for that matter, nor are they regularly in contact on a daily basis with their parents, but they're by no means alone or abandoned or lacking in support. And in fact, they're able to do a whole lot of what they do precisely because that's not the situation. They're in fact in important social relationships with adults. And importantly, those adults are accepting of these children as, you could call it, legitimate members of society participating in economic activity that is both valued and tolerated, in the sense that they're not being regularly kicked out or forced from the premises or otherwise persecuted, say by police or whoever else. Let me stop there for a minute. I'll let those ideas sort of sink in and see if people want to add on. I think, pick and choose in terms of what else we want to talk about. And so I will, again, wait for anyone else who might want to chime in. So she goes on to explain that, and this is, I'll read a quick quote that pertains to precisely what we were just talking about on page 88 here. So she wants us to realize that our perception, and this is coming back to that contradiction where we're absolutely enamored with Hope Blooms, but very frustrated or concerned about child labor in an international context. And so she says, as childhood becomes increasingly idealized in the West as a time for playing and dreaming, the reality of most children's lives is likely to be viewed critically by international child rights legislators. As a result, it becomes harder to treat, sorry, I missed a sentence. As a result, it becomes harder to treat with the necessary objectivity, i.e. thinking about it with the necessary objectivity. Whether in aid agency reports, media stories, or academic literature, the use of child labor is decried as being altogether bad, not denying children access to a childhood in which formal education is easily accessible and is each child's integral right. And so she brought up a couple of things there that I think are really important, one of which is play, and the idea that children are being robbed of their childhood if they work. And this is another one of the sort of areas where Burr is quick to point out that despite the fact, and again, I want to repeat this a couple of times, despite the fact that Burr herself would prefer these children didn't have to work in the context that they're working, and that she recognizes there are downsides to the work, along with the benefits. But one of the things that she points to is that if we're worried that the work and play have to be these mutually exclusive things, and if you're doing one, you can't do the other. I mean, it actually flies in the face, I would argue, of our own understanding of our own work, that our work has to be like filled only with work and sort of these undertakings that are very distinct from play, that i.e. they can't be enjoyable. But in fact, as she hangs out with these children in this context of urban Vietnam, she's regularly seeing children who, when, for example, business is slow, they'll take an opportunity to play a game of whatever, name a game of tag. There's this game that's a little bit like hopscotch that Vietnamese children regularly do. Or they might just jump on their bikes and go ride around the park for 20 minutes because business is slow. And so Burr doesn't pick up on this quite as much as I would like her to have done. Oh, I only have 10 minutes left. But there's a couple of things about that observation that are really important. One of which is, man, it seems like children in Vietnam might have work-play relationships figured out a whole lot better than we do. You know, there's this new research that says sitting is the new smoking, because most adults spend their entire day not doing anything but work, and so much of that is sitting at a table. Where if we just broke our work up and paid attention to the work habits, I should say the work play habits of children in Vietnam, we might learn something. The other part of this, and again, we don't have enough time in this lecture to go into in depth, but I'd be happy to hear people's thoughts nonetheless. There's two aspects of our own expectations around play and work that I think need to be pointed out, because they further, in my mind, highlight the contradiction. So on the one hand, and we will actually talk about child sports later on, so we'll pick up on that more later, but certainly, you know, there are institutions across the globe pointing to child sports basically as a form of child abuse in terms of how much time and how strict some sports activities are undertaken. To the point where literally there are child rights abuse cases in China and Russia and various other places that have nothing to do with factories. It's about gymnastics, for example. And so we see this in the North American context, where we literally have children who participate at a level of sports that is absolutely, in my opinion, or well, okay, I'll stand back a little bit, almost certainly conceptualized in my mind as work. It's not about entertainment or play. The goal is to do something really, really well, and with the ultimate goal, and we'll get to this when we talk about sports, of things like college scholarships or, you know, a job in the MBA. But if we back up again and think about anytime, and this is my criticism of our education system in general, but we continually think about our education system as preparing children for work, and we don't bat an eye that that's what it's about. So I definitely stop in my tracks when I hear this and go, well, so we're willing to let our children spend 6 to 8 hours a day for 12 years getting ready to work. But we don't want them actively participating in something that would be work itself. And in fact, we regularly, in a context like Vietnam, highlight how work is keeping children away from their education. And then you think to yourself, well, I thought education was about getting a job. And so Burr doesn't take it quite that far, but it's something that I throw in there, because in fact, she points out that in addition to children quite successfully balancing work and play, she came across multiple examples of children who are themselves, with not a whole lot of parental, but maybe a little more adult supervision, successfully negotiating an existence where they're able to continue their education, at least in part, while they undertake these jobs. And the jobs themselves, it's really important, and this is what Burr comes back to on a regular basis throughout the text. They're there precisely because these families cannot afford to live and have a sustainable household without the income from children. Comes back to the earlier statement I made. Well, yeah, lots of these parents, if they had the option, wouldn't have their children working. They would have them in school, but that isn't an option. And so obviously what Burr wants us to be thinking about in the final analysis is that it does absolutely no good to have these very negative opinions about child labor, to assume that all child labor is exploitative and sort of like straightforwardly horrible, and that it is undertaken in families where parents don't care about their children. It's undertaken in households in parts of the world, including Canada, where the labor is necessary, precisely because global inequality has put those families in a position where they absolutely need the income in order to do basic things like feed the family, pay rent, or ideally work towards the purchase of a home. And then, of course, also things like paying for education for siblings. So these are all the sort of things that she's learning as she looks at child labor, both in terms of how it's viewed from a sort of outside perspective, what the lived experience is, meaning that the work itself both has positive and negative impacts. And one of the things that she sort of ends the next chapter, which is closely related, is that perhaps, and this is a perhaps the reason that something like what she's describing, i.e. the multiple successes that she sees among street children, that's in quotes, what it does is it raises what she calls troubling questions. And I wonder if people have any ideas about what she means by that, because she isn't, even in the book, she doesn't really clearly articulate. So if we accept that children can do this and that it's actually in many ways beneficial for them, what are the troubling questions that that sort of highlights? Any thoughts? Well, the couple that I sort of come to mind is, well, what does it say about the family as an institution? If these children are able to do this in Vietnam, is that one of the reasons where we find it such an affront to our sensibilities? Is it because we actually fear, well, wait a minute, maybe our children don't really need us as adults as much as we think they do? Maybe the family itself is something that sort of takes a hit if we're not careful in sort of fairly strongly critiquing the lifestyle. And one of the other things that Burr is pointing out is that most of these children, in her opinion, are not forced into this. They're choosing to do it. And in fact, when the either police or other government agencies or NGOs intervene, oftentimes it's only temporarily. And as soon as the children are able to, they're back doing what they, in many ways, are choosing to do. And of course, choosing to do within a very obvious context, i.e. One in which their family is poor or low income. But she does certainly frame it as at least something like a choice, as opposed to them being coerced and forced into doing this, for sure. And I think that's an important part of it. We only have a couple of minutes left. I'd love to answer one question if someone has one, or just entertain someone's thought. All right, well, I will, I guess, leave it at that. I hope that, and I will make a concerted effort to get the readings. Just a reminder, next time we'll be hearing from Andrea, Andrea Auger, sorry, is her last name, from the Caring Society. So yeah, please tune in and we will see you next time. And those of you who are listening to this as a recording, again, I'd love if you came to the live version and were interested in asking a question or two. Oh, we have one question. Hold on, I have 1 minute left. Well, so Daniel's pointing out that this is about low-income children and not affluent children. Well, yes and no. And Daniel, it's a perfect thing for us to take up when we move into our seminar after this. So, all right, I'm going to stop the recording. And again, thanks.